So part two, applying texture to our composition. So we've brought in our composition and applied some color to the different areas. And we've also edited our textures in preparation for applying them to our drawing. So now we want to actually bring these textures into this composition that we have. So the first thing that we want to do for this is we want to go into Photoshop and go to File, Place Embedded, and we're going to find that previous file that we've just saved out, wherever you have saved that out, as the PSD file, and we're going to go ahead and click Place. Now, when it drops it in there, it's going to constrain it to the proportions of our page here. So I actually want to make this a little bit larger right off the bat so that my textures are a nice high quality for me to experiment with, and I can always edit later on. So I'm just going to go ahead and use my Shift and Option key. By holding that together, we can expand this whole thing out from the center instead of just from one side. Shift and Option will expand from the center. And I'm going to go ahead and click Enter. So I've transformed this to go a little bit larger, and because I placed it as an embedded file, it's now embedded within this composition. So what I'd like to do here is I'd like to place this texture within these several elements of the composition. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have to create a clipping mask for this particular texture to sit within these particular shapes. And then I'm going to duplicate that layer and do it for the different shapes that I have. So in this case, I have 3 different shapes that are colorized. So I'll be using at least 3 different textures to bring texture into those different areas. So what I can do first is figure out which area I want to apply this texture to first. So as long as I'm in my artwork layer down here at the very bottom, I can go back to my magic wand tool and reselect that area of blue that I have for this particular fill here. So within my artwork layer, I can use my magic wand tool and select that area of color. Then I can come back up here to my texture layer and make it visible again and highlight that layer so that I'm applying any changes to that specific layer. And we can see that I have these marching ants sitting on top of that actual texture. So down here at the bottom of our layers, there's actually an Add Layer Mask button. So as long as I have this area already selected and I'm on the appropriate layer of this texture, I can just hit this Add Layer Mask button and it'll apply that texture within that area that I had selected using my magic wand tool. Now, what I'd like to be able to do is actually see through this texture to be able to pull out some of that color that I've already applied. So up here at the top of our layer palettes, you'll see your blending options for each individual layer. So for this particular texture layer, as long as I have that highlighted, I can drop down this menu and start playing with different ways to apply this texture. You'll notice that each one of these has a different look and a feel depending on the contrast and the color that you're using. And you can kind of just go through here and experiment what you think looks best for each particular texture. And I would experiment using different blending modes for the different textures just to get a little bit more acquainted with them. So that looks pretty good. I've applied this texture to this specific area of color within the composition, but I actually want to shift this a little bit within that composition as well. So you'll notice within my layer here, I have 2 different thumbnails now. I have my thumbnail of my original artwork, and I have this new thumbnail of my clipping mask. And you can see that the area of white is what's being exposed to reveal this texture, and all the other areas are filled in with black, meaning it's hiding that texture behind this clipping mask. Same thing is happening with this color of fill here, essentially. So you'll also notice that between these 2 thumbnails, there's a lock icon. If I click on that lock icon, what it does is it enables me to manipulate these thumbnails individually versus the same thing. If I bring that icon back and I try to move this around, it's going to move that whole clipping mask around within that actual shape, right? But if I unclick that and I click on the thumbnail of my actual artwork, not the thumbnail of the clipping mask, but the thumbnail of my artwork, I can actually move the textures beneath that clipping mask to reveal any part of that textured paper that I want to for this particular area. So I might want to leave it with something like this for this one here, and then go and apply a different texture for the next color here. So let's do the same thing. We now want to apply a different texture to this area of orange here. So we could either go up to File, Place Embedded, and bring that file back in, or we can use this same layer here and just delete this clipping mask. First, we'd want to duplicate the layer and then delete the clipping mask. So if we hold the Option button over this particular layer and drag up, you'll notice that it brings up two different arrows telling me that I'm copying that layer. And if I drop it right on top, you'll notice that it created a copy of that particular layer. So again, I'm going to go back. All I did was hold the Option key, click on this layer, and bring it up to copy that particular layer there. So you'll notice that the clipping mask is applied. It's copied that entire layer over. So I actually want to erase this clipping mask and make a new one. So again, I'm going to select the thumbnail of the actual clipping mask, and I'm just going to hit the, I'm going to right click and select Delete Layer Mask. And that will actually delete the layer mask. So now I have this texture sitting over this entire thing again. And the reason it looks a little different is because we still have a different blending mode on, right? So we could change that if we want to see it a little bit differently. But this time I want to apply the texture to this particular area over here. So again, I want to come down to my original artwork layer, go over to my magic wand, select within that area here, and I want to come back up to the texture of the layer that I'm working on. And as long as I have that selection over the layer of the texture that I'm working on, I can again just come down here to the Add Layer Mask button, click that, and it will go ahead and apply that texture within that new area of the composition. So again, if I wanted to move that texture around behind that clipping mask, I could just unlock my two different thumbnails here, click on the thumbnail of the actual texture, come up here to my directional arrows, and I can actually move this around to include whichever texture I want to for this particular one here. So we might find that for some of these, we need to also make these textures a little bit larger. So we can always come up here to Image, Edit, Transform, and or we could go to Free Transform actually. That'd probably be the easiest one to go. And then with Free Transform, it's going to bring up the ability to enlarge this again. So by clicking on an area of the artwork, I can just hold that Shift button to keep those constraints proportional and move that texture to any part of this artwork that I want to. So essentially, you'll repeat that process for all of these. And again, like I said, once you have several different textures going on for these different layers, I would encourage you to come up here to the blending modes and start experimenting with how these textures, or how the blending mode is going to affect that texture on that particular color here. Because what you'll see is you'll get different results for each one. And it really just depends on what you're going for that particular look and feel of that texture. But you can certainly experiment with different ways of blending modes. You can also adjust the opacity for that particular texture. If we wanted some sort of blending mode like Pinlight here, but we wanted to actually bring down the texture to about 40%, we could also adjust that opacity there. And as long as I'm selected on this particular layer, all those changes will be made to that particular layer. So essentially, you are going to go through within your composition and apply different colors to each one of the different shapes that are enclosed within your composition. And then you're going to bring in your texture file and apply a texture using a clipping mask to each one of those shapes within that composition as well. Experiment with the blending mode on that color, and then save out to your file once you're done. So once I've completed this with all my different shapes in here, filled with colors and textures applied to all of them, I again want to come up here to File, Save As, And I'm going to go ahead and save this with my first initial, last name, composition, texture, and you can save that to wherever you would like to save that. You want to make sure that you save this as a Photoshop format so that you can come back and edit it if you need to as well. And you also want to make sure that layers is toggled on so that you will save out all these individual layers. So once you have it titled correctly in the correct spot as a Photoshop format and the layer is selected, you can hit save, hit OK, and you can always come back and revisit this and edit it at any later time. So again, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me, and hopefully you find this practice a little helpful to apply some textures, possibly to your self-portrait or any of the other projects that we'll be doing in this class.